Welcome back to the deep dive. Today we have a pretty demanding assignment in front of us.
You could say that.
We're tackling a massive source, a really comprehensive theological exposition of the foundational texts of Islam, the Qur'an, and the Sunnah. But we're not just looking for spiritual guidance here. We are looking for this structural blueprint.
That's exactly right. The material gives us a framework for a complete way of life. It touches on, well, everything.
Everything like personal faith, I assume?
Oh, absolutely. Personal faith, moral ethics, but then it goes into these incredibly complex social regulations and, crucially, political accountability.
Right. And our mission today is to do a really surgical deep dive here. We want to extract the governing principles.
So how does this foundational doctrine actually define justice, governance, social order?
And specifically, the mechanisms for community welfare. That's the core of it for our listener.
The implementation part.
Exactly. The nuts and bolts.
Yeah.
We're not just analyzing what people are told to do, but how the system is, structurally designed to make sure that welfare actually happens.
And that leaders are held responsible for it.
Yes.
Precisely. And to start, you really have to acknowledge the scope. The underlying Arabic term for this whole way of life, it refers to something so much more extensive than what we in modern societies tend to call religion.
It's not just a Sunday morning thing.
Not at all. It's a holistic system. It's private and it's public. It covers acts of worship, yes, but it also has these incredibly detailed instructions for commerce, for political processes, for day-to-day social interactions.
And that holistic approach, that immediately sets the foundation for authority, doesn't it? The whole system operates under one singular focus.
Absolutely. The foundational rule for the entire architecture comes from the Qur'an's call for unity. Serving God alone, associating nothing with him.
And this next part is key.
Right. Not taking one another as lords besides Allah. That theological decree is the ultimate constitutional constraint.
What does that mean in practice, then?
It means all human governance, all political power, has to be subservient to this divine rule. Any law made by a person that goes against the explicit divine law is, well, it's null and void, period.
So let's really unpack this mandate for a guided society. We can start with that sheer scope you mentioned. The material is very clear. This isn't designed for a separation of, say, the mosque and the market.
Correct. For a contemporary audience, an audience that's used to these strict secular divisions, the breadth of this system is probably its most challenging feature.
It covers everything.
The entirety of life. I mean, we are talking about everything from prescribed hygiene practices and specific laws of contract, all the way to the methodology for electing or even correcting a ruler. It just weaves worship, ethics, legal statutes, and political processes into one seamless fabric.
So there's no part of life that falls outside the defined parameters of this system.
None. And that leads us straight to the role of knowledge and intellectual inquiry within such a fixed, comprehensive framework.
Which seems like a contradiction.
It does. But the source makes this fascinating claim that this faith is one of clarity. It lacks mysteries.
Okay, what do they mean by that?
It's an important distinction. The material actively encourages people to seek clarity, to ask questions about anything that seems unclear or raises some doubt.
Because if the system is an operational manual for life, it can't be all vague and esoteric.
Exactly. It has to be clear. However, the path to getting those answers is very strictly defined.
And that seems like a critical structural check on interpretation.
Right.
You're encouraged to ask, but who gets to answer?
Answers to religious questions are reserved only for the knowledgeable, for the scholars. And this mandate is in place specifically to prevent people from, just fabricating answers or making false claims about the divine law.
Which is considered a great sin.
A great sin, yes. So you can't just follow popular opinion or your own emotional whims. You have to seek the authoritative answer from those trained in the law and the foundational texts. It institutionalizes expertise.
So inquiry is valued, but you need a certain intellectual humility, especially when you're dealing with the unseen.
Exactly. The source draws a really crucial boundary here. There are matters related to the unseen, like, say, the precise nature of angels or the minute details of creation that just surpass human comprehension.
And knowing those details wouldn't really benefit humanity's moral or social progress anyway.
Correct. So inquiry into those things is considered pointless. But where knowledge is beneficial, in the physical world, in moral conduct, in social architecture, inquiry isn't just permitted, it's encouraged.
I find that explicit connection to general science and knowledge so interesting. It doesn't frame faith as a barrier to understanding the world.
Quite the opposite.
It seems to frame the observation of the natural world as part of understanding the divine plan.
That's because belief and knowledge, or science, are seen as intrinsically linked. They're forces that elevate a person's rank. So when the source addresses these huge questions like human worth, it actually cites verses describing the miraculous creation of man as direct, observable answers.
So pursuing knowledge, whether it's theological or secular, is a good thing.
It's a meritorious act, provided that that intellectual pursuit respects the parameters of truth that were established by the revelation. It's a guided, purposeful intellectualism.
Which brings us to the permanence of the law. I mean, if this law is complete and covers all of life, how can it stay fixed while the world is constantly evolving? This feels like the core structural tension.
And the source addresses this tension head-on. It uses the analogy of assembly instructions for a machine.
Okay.
The core beliefs and the law, the Shari'a, they haven't changed since Revelation. So if a society fails, or if a leader makes a terrible mistake, or if followers practice corruption...
The instructions aren't false.
The instructions aren't false. The fault lies with the operator.
So the stability of the entire system rests on the fidelity of the practitioner, not on the flexibility of the code itself.
Precisely. And this is where the mechanism for dealing with new issues comes in, even though the law is considered complete. While the Qur'an is the final, protected book, its practical application involves this continuous, authorized intellectual effort.
Known as ijtihad.
Yes, independent reasoning by qualified scholars. It's used to derive rulings for new circumstances, things like bioethics, digital finance, modern governance structures, from the prominent principles established in the primary sources.
So the law is finished, but its application requires this very sophisticated, trained interpretation, always going back to the original text.
Always.
That's a crucial detail. It means the system is rigid in its principles, but it has a built-in mechanism for scholarly adaptation. It prevents stagnation while maintaining that ultimate divine authority.
And the assertion remains powerful. The Qur'an contains all the laws that allow an excellent society to arise, covering moral, religious, social, and economic life. It's presented as a fully comprehensive social architecture.
Okay, so if the foundation is laid by this unified, comprehensive legal code, the real question for our listener, who's focused on community implementation, is how do spiritual acts translate into mandated, practical community action?
Right.
That brings us to our second section. How do the primary acts of worship function as concrete mechanisms for social cohesion and, importantly, mandatory welfare? Let's start with communal prayer, Salah.
We often view prayer as a purely private spiritual act, but the source really emphasizes its sociological role.
Its function.
Its function, yes. While Salah is fundamentally described as a vital contact, a sila, with the creator pulling the individual back from an excessive focus on worldly things, the 5 daily communal prayers are institutionalized social services.
It's a mandatory 5 times a day community gathering. You literally can't avoid your neighbors.
And that regularity is the key structural benefit. Muslims meet daily, often crossing social lines, which strengthens feelings of love and familiarity.
But more practically, for a community administrator, it provides an immediate, systematic way to check the social temperature.
That's the perfect way to put it. This is where needs are identified. Is someone sick? Is someone impoverished? Has a family suffered some misfortune? The community is compelled to ask and then offer help, comfort, or advice right there on the spot.
And the physical act of prayer itself, standing shoulder to shoulder, reinforces that ideal of equality that has to underpin the justice system we were just talking about.
Precisely. Everyone stands shoulder to shoulder, old, young, rich, poor, the leader, the subordinate. All those differences are abolished in that moment of humility before the creator. Everyone facing the same direction.
It's a powerful ritual.
It's a profound psychological and sociological reinforcement that no matter your economic or political status, you are fundamentally equal before the law and before God.
So that sets the necessary moral stage. But if prayer is the daily social temperature check, then zakat, the obligatory alms. That's the mandatory, non-negotiable economic infrastructure designed to ensure financial equity.
Yes, zakat is the economic pillar. It is codified wealth redistribution. The source defines it very clearly. It's a specific percentage, usually 2.5%, levied on most forms of wealth savings, gold, silver, business inventory.
And there's a minimum threshold.
There is. It has to be held above a minimum threshold, the nisab, which is currently equivalent to about 85 grams of gold for a full lunar year.
This sounds a lot like a wealth tax, but the source makes a sharp distinction from state taxation.
It does. It's distinct from taxes collected by a state because zakat is a divine religious obligation on the wealthy Muslim. Non-Muslim citizens are not required to pay it.
Okay.
And the funds are legally and morally earmarked solely for 8 specific categories of recipients defined in the Qur'an. This prevents the state from just diverting it to other uses like building roads or funding the military.
So it's a unique, mandatory, faith-governed wealth transfer mechanism.
That's it.
What's the overriding objective here? Why is this mandatory?
The primary goal is structural, to eliminate poverty and, crucially, its dangerous social consequences: theft, robbery, murder.
And to foster solidarity.
Profound solidarity and shared responsibility, yes. The Prophet's warning cited in the source is stark. It connects poverty to a collective failure.
How so?
It warns that if people in a locality go hungry, God detaches himself from that community.
Wow. That turns indifference from a personal failing into a collective religious and administrative failure. It's an immediate accountability metric for any local governance to ensure effective distribution.
Absolutely. And the system dictates exactly where the money must go, which is vital for community implementation. The 8 specific categories are laid out.
Which are?
The poor, the needy, the zakat administrators themselves.
Wait. Zakat administrators are paid from the zakat funds. That's a really interesting detail for implementation.
It's a core administrative feature. It ensures that the bureaucracy required to collect and distribute the funds efficiently is sustained by the system itself. It doesn't rely on state funds or just volunteers.
It professionalizes the mandatory welfare mechanism, ensuring competency and continuity.
Exactly. The other categories are those whose hearts are to be reconciled. So new converts or ally slaves or captives, the indebted, those in the way of God, which could be defense or public good and travelers.
So the funds aren't for discretionary spending. They're a legal right for these defined groups.
A legal right.
And what about those who try to evade this mandatory obligation? How does the doctrine actually enforce payment?
The enforcement mechanism is spiritual, and the warnings are severe. To the point of being terrifying.
It's a lot.
The source cites verses against hoarding. It describes those who fail to pay zakat having their accumulated gold and silver heated in the fires of hell and then used to torment them on the day of resurrection.
It's very specific.
Very. It says their sides, backs, and faces will be burned with their own hoarded wealth. This is not some gentle moral encouragement. This is absolute spiritual coercion designed to make sure the system is financially liquid and the wealthy fulfill their collective obligation. It makes financial selfishness a profound spiritual peril.
Okay, moving now from those mandatory welfare mechanisms to the principles of law implementation. The emphasis on justice and equality seems foundational to maintaining any kind of social order.
It is the bedrock. The core principle is absolute and non-negotiable equality before the law. The source states, very emphatically, that the implementation of the law makes zero distinction based on wealth, nobility, political status, or race.
All people are equal.
All people are equal. If the system fails here, the entire social architecture just collapses.
And the source uses the Prophet's own family to illustrate the extreme commitment to this judicial impartiality.
The anecdote of Fatima is, well, it's perhaps the ultimate statement on the rule of law.
Tell us that story.
A woman from a very noble tribe was caught stealing. Some influential people tried to intervene to spare her the prescribed punishment because they were worried about the dishonor to her family's status.
Of course.
The Prophet publicly rejected this plea. He stated clearly that historical nations before them were ruined because they applied the law selectively.
They punished the weak and spared the noble.
Exactly. And then he made the shocking, definitive declaration regarding his own lineage.
Which was?
He declared that if his own daughter, Fatima, stole, he would cut off her hand.
The political and social weight of that statement is just, it's hard to overstate.
It established an immediate and unquestionable standard. The law applies even to the most sacred and powerful individuals. This principle of judicial equality is presented as the precondition for the very survival of the nation.
That sets an impossibly high bar for those in power to uphold the law, especially when it costs them politically or personally.
And that law protects fundamental rights. The source mentions that the blood, property, and dignity of a person are sacred.
Violations are condemned.
Strongly. As spreading corruption on earth and destroying crops and descendants.
Can we detail some of the other specific actions that are prohibited because they fundamentally disrupt community life and social trust?
Absolutely. Beyond the primary theological violation of polytheism, the prohibitions focus heavily on social stability. So, intentional murder, for one.
Okay.
Unchastity or adultery is heavily condemned because it damages the family unit. And then a major financial violation is consuming the property of orphans unjustly.
Which is described in some very visceral terms.
The most visceral terms, as consuming fire in one's own belly.
And what about the corruption that eats away at the administrative and justice systems from the inside?
Corruption in the form of false witness and bribery is highlighted as profoundly toxic.
False witness breaks the trust in the courts.
Completely. Especially swearing falsely to seize someone's property. And bribery is equally damning. The source states that God curses the briber, the recipient, and even the intermediary.
The middleman.
The middleman, yes. And the reason for this comprehensive condemnation is that bribery fundamentally warps the fairness of society. It leads to this unauthorized, unjust appropriation of public or private funds. It ensures that meritocracy and justice are replaced by wealth and influence.
Let's shift to economic stability, which, like zakat, seems highly regulated to ensure perpetual fairness. The prohibition against usury or interest is central.
Usury, or riba, is strictly forbidden. The source sees it as the fundamental evil in economic regulation.
Why?
Because it exploits the need and labor of the poor. It allows the wealthy to claim funds without providing any real counter-service or taking any commensurate risk.
And the consequence of that is?
The inevitable accumulation of wealth in the hands of a small segment of society, which directly undermines the welfare goals of zakat. The system structurally attempts to choke off the primary engine of wealth concentration.
So the system is mandating that economic activity must be based on risk-sharing or actual effort, not just guaranteed returns on liquid capital.
Exactly. And the alternative is kindness. It actively promotes interest-free loans and highly recommends deferring payment for a debtor who's in distress.
Or even forgiving the debt entirely.
Yes, or even better, forgiving it completely. This balances the strict negative prohibition against usury with a positive mandate for merciful economic behavior.
What about regulations concerning fair trade and access to essential goods, specifically monopoly?
Monopoly, or the hoarding of essential goods to drive up prices, is strictly forbidden. The monopolist is designated as a sinner.
So what can be done?
The governing authority is given the necessary power to intervene. If the hoarding is harming people, especially with essential public needs like food or medicine, the authority is obligated to force the sale of those goods at a fair profit.
That is a powerful tool for communal protection against market abuse, a clear mandate for state intervention.
It is.
And there's a related prohibition on certain kinds of taxation on basic commerce.
Yes. The source specifically mentions that taxes that traders have to pay just to bring goods to market, you could call them toll taxes or unjustified administrative fees, are forbidden.
Because they're an unjustified seizure of money.
Exactly. The goal is to facilitate open, equitable commerce without these arbitrary financial impediments that just end up harming consumers or honest traders.
Finally, we have to look at the mandated mechanisms designed to prevent massive generational wealth accumulation, which, again, undermines the whole welfare state.
This is a structural masterstroke, really, and it's achieved through two systems. First, there's the fixed, detailed inheritance system.
How does that work?
Unlike Western laws, where an individual often has full freedom to write their will however they want, this system is governed by specific, unchangeable fractional divisions. Wealth must be divided among all rightful heirs, male and female, young and old.
How does that fragmentation actually work in practice to break up these large estates?
By mandating these fixed fractions, the system guarantees the decentralization of capital every single generation.
For example,
A wife might receive an eighth, a daughter a half, and the rest goes to other relatives according to these set shares. So over, say, 3 generations, a massive estate is systematically reduced and distributed across dozens of individuals and families.
the key sociological benefit being that it makes the long-term dynastic accumulation of massive wealth in the hands of a tiny slice of society virtually impossible.
It's mandatory continuous capital dispersion.
That continuous decentralization is a defining feature of the economic system. And what about the second mechanism, the charitable endowments?
The second mechanism is the WAC, or charitable endowment. This involves setting aside assets, land, buildings, income-generating businesses whose principal cannot be sold or transferred privately.
So only the income can be used.
Only the income generated. And there are 2 types. private, which is often for family protection, and general for public benefit, like hospitals, schools, or community infrastructure.
And the permanence of this whack ensures that wealth is taken out of the speculative private sphere.
And put into perpetual service for the social good, further bolstering public welfare and infrastructure.
This moves us neatly into the political realm. If all law is divinely derived and fixed, how is human leadership constrained? And how is the community protected from tyranny?
Well, the constraint is inherent in the system. Political arrangements are secondary to the divine law. All people, and this includes the ruler, are equal before these rules.
So no ruler, no matter how powerful, may act against the divine law.
Correct. Their authority is delegated, not inherent. It's a trust.
That instantly removes the possibility of absolute sovereignty, as we might understand it in some secular traditions. But how is the citizen supposed to hold this divinely constrained leader accountable in a practical sense?
The concept is conditional obedience.
Conditional obedience.
Yes. If the ruler contradicts the established divine law, obedience is explicitly not obligatory. The prophet taught that obedience is required only in what he loves or hates, unless forbidden acts are commanded.
So that provides the fundamental check. The ultimate loyalty of the citizen rests with the law itself, not with the personality or the decrees of the leader.
Precisely. The citizen has a mandated mechanism for principled non-compliance if the ruler abuses their power by straying from the codified system.
And this check is expected to be vocal and transparent, not something hidden.
Absolutely. The ruler must be accessible, transparent, and rule justly, making sure every citizen receives their right. The historical examples of the second caliph, Omar, are definitive illustrations of how this accountability was supposed to function on the ground.
Let's delve into that famous anecdote of Omar and the garments, because it speaks volumes about mandated transparency.
It perfectly illustrates that the ruler's financial transparency is non-negotiable. Omar was addressing the people, and a nomad questioned where he got the 2 garments he was wearing.
Because everyone else only got enough cloth for one.
Exactly. The nomad was challenging the leader's personal wealth and resource allocation in real time. Omar had to stop his official address, ask his son to stand up, and explain that his son had donated his personal share to his father because the caliph was a tall man and needed 2 pieces.
And only after that rigorous justification and financial transparency was provided.
Only then did the nomad declare, "Now we listen and obey."
That is profound. The leader's authority is literally contingent upon justified action and complete financial openness, even for something as minor as an extra piece of cloth.
It's a foundational lesson in political trust. And if that sets the standard for transparency, the second anecdote sets the standard for accepting criticism.
This is the one with the sword.
The one with the sword. When Omar asked the people to correct him if he strayed, a man, again, a simple nomad, declared in no uncertain terms that he would use his sword to make Omar straight.
That is an astonishing statement to make to the highest authority of the time. What was Omar's reaction?
Instead of reacting with anger or having the man imprisoned for sedition, Omar praised God for creating people who possess the courage and conviction to correct his mistakes.
It confirms that severe criticism, even the threat of physical correction, was an expected and accepted feature of just, accountable leadership.
Yes, it implies resistance to tyranny is built in.
Beyond this radical personal accountability, what role does institutionalized consultation play in the political process?
Consultation, or shura, is mandatory for matters concerning the interest of the community. The ruler is required to seek the counsel of those who possess insight and knowledge. The sources link the performance of shura directly with the main pillars of the faith, underscoring its institutional importance.
Who exactly qualifies as possessing insight and knowledge? And is the consultation always binding?
Those consulted must be people of wisdom, experience, technical competence, and moral uprightness, not just whoever's politically convenient.
So experts.
Experts, yes. The obligation is to consult widely, but interpretations differ on whether the final decision after consultation is legally binding on the ruler if they disagree.
But the consultation itself must be genuine.
It must be genuine, not just a formality. The prophet himself accepted advice from a companion to relocate troops during a battle, overruling his own initial tactical decision. It shows it must be taken seriously.
That ensures intellectual input and community buy-in, even if the final decision rests with the authority. Now, what defines the ideal conduct of the ruler once in power, especially toward the vulnerable?
The description is highly protective and, you could say, paternalistic. The ruler is likened to a mild shepherd who guides animals to the best pasture and protects them from harm, or a loving father providing for his children.
The key responsibility is avoiding oppression.
Exactly. The ruler must not impose heavy burdens the citizens can't bear or drive them into distress. The authority is a trust, an amana, not an opportunity for exploitation.
And the consequences for failing to live up to this standard are dramatic.
The stakes are incredibly high. The prophet invoked a curse upon rulers who burdened the community and a blessing upon those who treated them mildly.
The rulers also warned against being like a slave who wastes the master's wealth.
Right, which means wasting the state's trust, and who neglects the children, meaning the citizens. The power is temporary, but the responsibility is eternal.
Finally, how does the system ensure competence in administration, especially when all these welfare mechanisms rely on competent deployment?
Competence is legally mandated. The appointment of officials must be based strictly on suitability or fähigkeit, ability, yes. Assigning administrative tasks to those incapable of fulfilling them is explicitly deemed a betrayal of that trust, the amana.
In fact, the source cites this particular betrayal.
Yes. Putting the unqualified in positions of power is cited as a sign of the approaching end times. This establishes meritocracy as a core requirement for a functioning, just administration. It ensures that zakat funds are handled by competent professionals, for example, not just political allies.
We've covered macro governance and economic structure. Now let's move to the micro level. The ethics that regulate daily social life, which are just as rigorously defined. The standard for neighborly rights is astonishingly high.
It is an intense, mandatory social connection. It's designed to ensure local safety and community resilience.
How so?
The source reports that the prophet was instructed by the angel Gabriel so strongly on the neighbor's rights that he believed neighbors would actually be granted a share of inheritance.
That elevates the neighbor to a quasi-family member in terms of legal and moral obligation.
It does, and that mandate of safety and peace is not just a passive thing either.
It's active. Correct. A Muslim is warned explicitly that he is no believer if his neighbor is not safe from his maliciousness. The best neighbor is defined simply as the one who is the kindest to his neighbor.
It places a mandatory preventative obligation on every single individual to actively ensure their immediate social surroundings are peaceful and secure. It makes neighborhood tranquility a matter of core faith.
Yes.
But what happens in a community setting when there is actual conflict or when a neighbor is actively hostile or troublesome?
The advice given is striking because it mandates a response of patience and virtue, not immediate retaliation. A person is advised to respond to a troublesome neighbor's disobedience to God by demonstrating obedience to God towards him. Meaning using prolonged patience, kindness, and moral excellence, rather than meeting malice with malice. It's designed to absorb and neutralize local conflict before it can escalate.
This high standard of conduct is also directed toward resolving larger disputes within the community. Absolutely. Reconciliation between people holds an extremely esteemed primary position. It's ranked as an act of worship no less important than prayer, fasting, and alms.
The prophet stated that disputes can destroy piety.
Yes. It's viewed as a corrosive force that eats away at the solidarity necessary for the whole social structure to function.
And to achieve this reconciliation, the source describes an allowance that seems to contradict the general ethical framework.
It does. There is an allowance for what you might call expedient lying.
That's surprising.
It is. It's one of the very few permissible exceptions to the general prohibition against falsehood. It is permissible to lie to parties in conflict to facilitate reconciliation by inventing kind words they supposedly said about each other. This is permitted solely because restoring social harmony is deemed a higher ethical priority than absolute literal truth in that one very narrow context.
Finally, we come to the community's structural safety valve, enjoining good and forbidding wrong. This sounds like a mechanism for continuous, mandatory social quality control.
It is the core duty designed to combat injustice, corruption, and crime across all layers of society, from the micro level of neighbors to the macro level of the ruler's actions. It functions as a permanent quality control mechanism that applies to every member of the community based on their ability and authority.
And there's a famous hierarchy of action that dictates how to do this.
Yes. First, with power.
So, change it with the hand, with authority, if you have it.
Correct. If you're unable to do that, then change it with the tongue, with speech, public rebuke, or speaking out. And if you're still unable to do that, then with the heart.
Detestation.
Detestation, yes. Which is considered the absolute minimum level of faith required.
So it's not just a recommendation for activists. It's a duty that applies to everyone. It ensures a constant internal pressure toward moral accountability.
Correct. However, the source includes extremely stringent rules for the reformer to prevent this duty from causing anarchy or greater harm than the initial evil. This is crucial for implementation.
What are those rules of ethical intervention?
First, the reformer must not cause greater harm than the existing evil itself. You can't solve a small problem by creating a massive one. Second, they must not forbid others from doing what they themselves do. Hypocrisy voids the legitimacy of the call.
Makes sense.
And third, and critically, they must use mildness and patience. They must be prepared to endure the harm caused by taking on this difficult, thankless task.
This ensures the enforcement of public morality remains constructive, ethical, and non-hypocritical, maintaining social trust even while correcting mistakes. This deep dive has revealed a remarkable level of interconnected detail. The source material presents not just theological guidance, but a meticulously engineered governmental and social structure.
And every pillar, even worship, doubles as a mandatory mechanism for public cohesion and accountability.
Indeed, what we find is a system where individual religious adherence is inextricably tied to these really stringent communal, economic, and political obligations.
The entire structure is engineered through mechanisms like zakat, the inherent system, and the absolute prohibition of usury and monopoly to actively prevent poverty and ensure economic fairness.
And crucially, the system is designed to allow for radical political accountability, where a simple citizen can publicly challenge the financial transparency of the supreme ruler.
That's a key point.
The ultimate takeaway nugget for you, our listener, especially if you're focused on community implementation, is this. The concepts we often assume are purely private spiritual matters, like prayer or almsgiving, are simultaneously designed to be mandatory, structural mechanisms for community welfare and sociological cohesion. The entire structure aims to ensure dignity and distribute wealth automatically, backed by these strict, codified rules of transparency and economic justice for both the governed and the governors.
That holistic integration, where the spiritual, the economic, and the political are inseparable, that is the defining feature.
It is.
And the source concludes with a really provocative observation about modern life. It notes that while the material world sees increasing fulfillment of material wishes in many societies, particularly in the West, many people still feel a profound lack of meaning.
They're asking, why do I live? Where do I go?
Exactly. The text suggests the answer lies in seeking a righteous religion.
So considering the comprehensive, detailed, and non-optional nature of the ethical and societal regulations we've discussed, a system that legislates everything from economic fragmentation to mandatory welfare and radical political accountability, the final question for you, the listener, is this. Does a system that meticulously legislates the micro-details of public and private life ultimately provide the inner peace and inherent stability that modern secular societies often struggle to maintain through fragmented institutions?
The source certainly implies that this detailed structure provides profound security, citing the verse, "In the remembrance of Allah do hearts find rest."
Think about that. How structure creates stability.
A powerful closing thought. Thank you for joining us for this deep dive into the foundations of governance and justice in this doctrine.
Until next time, stay curious.